I would like to welcome you to this third session of our series on judgment. And I'm going to start by introducing with reading a few passages of scripture. And first of all, I want you to understand that God pronounced judgment long time ago by the prophets. The prophets pronounced judgment in their day, and in most cases, they equally pronounce judgment that will be at the end of days in which we are living today. So we're going to look at a few scriptures here to kind of set us in motion. Like I said last time, this is not an easy subject to talk on, but if we have to declare the whole counsel of God, well, these things must be declared, and people need to understand their future. And the one thing I like to say on the onset is that there is one way by which you can escape God's judgment. Whoever believes in Jesus and hides under Jesus will not come into condemnation, will not come into God's judgment. They will not suffer God's wrath. And so rather than spend time trying to wonder a lot, my invitation to you is that you avoid judgment by believing in Jesus Christ. Now, I want us to understand that the prophets took a lot of time to declare judgment in the past and judgment as will be in the last days. The first place we're going to turn to is in the book of Revelation. And in the book of Revelation, the word wrath, which means the judgment of God, comes up over and over. In fact, is you can even call it the book of wrath. And first, we're going to read first in Revelation chapter 19, verses 20. After John John wanted to worship the angel that was revealing the revelation to him. It says, "At this I fell at his feet to worship him, but he said to me, 'Do not do it. I am a fellow servant with you and with your brothers who hold to the testimony of Jesus.'" The testimony of Jesus. Worship God. For the testimony of Jesus is the spirit of prophecy. So if you hold to the testimony of Jesus, you hold to the spirit of prophecy. And it's unfortunate that today in the church, prophecy is not well handled, it's not well balanced. It's either part of the church totally ignores it, or there is the other extreme of excitement and a lot of prophets trying to declare new prophecy. But we are shown here that we will overcome by the testimony of Jesus, and the testimony of Jesus is the spirit of prophecy. Now let's go back again and read Revelations chapter, it's Revelation chapter 10. We'll read beginning from verse 5. It says, "Then the angel I had seen standing on the sea and on the land raised his right hand to heaven, and he swore by him who lives forever and ever, who created the heavens and all that is in them, the earth and all that is in it, and the sea and all that is in it. And he said, there will be no more delay. There will be no more delay. But in the days when the seventh angel is about to sound his trumpet, the mystery of God will be accomplished, just as he announced to his servants the prophets." So we know that the mystery of God in this end of days, as it's being proclaimed, was declared by God through the prophets. So it is important for us to turn to the prophets and see what they wrote about the last days. Turn to Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Daniel, Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum. They all declared God's judgment in the last days. And like I said, it's a sad thing that most of people who call themselves Christians today in the church are very ignorant about these things, which is why you may be surprised at what I'm saying. Like, I've never heard of this before. Why not? Because it's the devil's plan to make the church ignorant of God's judgment. Because when you go to the Word of God and realize God's judgment, and as you search into it, you see Satan, who he is, and how he is being exposed. So, with that in mind, one more verse we're going to read here is 2 Peter chapter 1. 2 Peter chapter 1, beginning from verse 19. It says, "And we have the word of the prophets made more certain, and you will do well to pay attention to it, as to a light shining in a dark place, until the day dawns and the morning star rises in your hearts." You have to understand what Peter is saying here. We have the words of the prophets, the ones that I've just listed. And it says, we will do well to pay attention to it. We will do well to pay attention to the words of the prophets. If you are a Christian and you do not pay attention to what the prophets declared, you don't understand the mystery of God. You will not understand what is going on in the world today. Now, in our last session, I talked about a statue that Nebuchadnezzar saw in Daniel 2 that basically, in a nutshell, revealed the history of Western civilization, what we call today Western civilization. All of that history and all its ramifications were shown to Nebuchadnezzar in a dream, in a statue. And it was also shown to him how Western civilization is going to end. Western civilization, as it stands today in all its magnificence, is going to go under God's judgment. All of it. And as if that was not enough, in Daniel chapter 7, God gives Daniel a dream in which he sees 4 beasts, and this beast or kingdom and progression reveals to us the history of Western civilization and how it's going to end. So these 2 elements, Daniel 2 and Daniel 7, both reveal the history of Western civilization and how it's going to end. It will all end as Jesus comes back and crushes it and smashes it to ashes. Nothing will be left. And what I'm saying this out of love, because there's lots of ignorant people don't know in the church that this is how this world is going to end, and the only people who are going to survive will not depend on where you are on planet Earth. It will only depend on what have you done with Jesus. He is the stone that is going to smash the earth and will crush everything in his path except those who have believed in Jesus Christ. And so as we continue in this next session, I'm going to be revealing a lot of stuff here. And I want to challenge you to go and do the research and understand things with a spiritual eye. It was revealed to Nebuchadnezzar and to Daniel that the 4th empire, which was Rome, Europeans, was going to devour the earth, trampling it underfoot and crushing its residue. And my contention is, and my interpretation is, that the colonial impulse and practice of Europeans as they migrated from Europe to North America, to South America, to Africa, into Asia, represented this Roman Empire crushing, devouring, and stamping underfoot the entire earth. Now you have to understand that maybe you've never really heard about it this way, but if you don't pay attention to prophecy, to what the prophets declared, you are not going to see this. So why will God judge Western civilization? And I want you to understand that it's not only Western civilization that is going to be judged, the entire world is going to be judged. But foremost are or is Western civilization. So why, in this session, I want you to understand why God will judge European nations and European nations that develop outside of Europe. And I'm going to go back. This is going to be more like a history lesson, more like a presentation. And I want to make the appeal that these are excerpts from my book that is not published, but part of it, I am publishing it on my website. And this is my website. If you want to know more of this, you can go to www.everlasting/gospel/n.com. You are going to see more of it there as I have written, and it would make a lot of sense to you looking at it, all of it at the same time. So my presentation today, I'm going to be reading a lot of my manuscript, and like I said, you can go to my website and you can read it there and understand it there, and you can go ahead and do your own research. Don't just rely on what I'm saying. Do your own research. Don't stay in ignorance. That is what the devil wants you to do, to stay in ignorance. Don't fight what you're going to hear. Research it and do the right thing. So first, I'm going to look at the rise of humanism in Europe, which will show us just how things developed. I said by the 12th and the 13th centuries AD, the medieval civilization had begun to wane, giving rise to the Renaissance, where people sought to revive the glories of classical antiquity. A noticeable aspect of the Renaissance was humanism. Humanism as a philosophy. In one sense, humanism was a return to the humanities like literature, poetry, and art. In another sense, humanism was the tendency to place humans at the center of the universe, making man the measure of all things. Man and his achievement became the center stage, and in a subtle way, turning attention from the creator to the creature. Humans became centers of attention, hence the birth of modern humanism as a philosophical movement or as a philosophical idea. And this paradigm shift from societal to individual achievement was manifested in the arts as important figures. I want you to note every aspect of what I'm presenting here so you're able to understand the scope of what I'm going to say. I'll say it again. This paradigm shift from societal to individual achievement was manifested in the arts as important figures of the past and present were sculptured and honored. Human figures sculptured and honored. Men were becoming gods, so to speak, as it is said in Psalms 82, verses 6 and 7. I said, ye are gods. You are sons of the Most High, but you will die like mere men. You will fall like every other ruler. So of this attitude of making and honoring human figures in images and statues, Paul writes, although they claimed to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images made to look like mortal man and birds and animals and reptiles. When we sculpture our important people, place them in places and honor them, it is idolatry. It is idolatry. That is how the Bible puts it. So, and I say, even in the church, sculptures of important figures, Bible characters, and so-called saints were erected. And this humanism has continued up to this day, with statues of important people and celebrities, especially political figures, erected all over the face of the earth. Now we know of the Egyptian pharaohs, how they carved the heads of their pharaohs on hillsides. Modern man is doing the same today. And sometimes we're able to see, take for instance, 17 years ago when the US went into Baghdad, Saddam's statue was sitting up there. We wanted to pull it down and we pulled it down. We have our own important figures in statues standing all around. We may find it very disgusting for a Chinese to put up a statue of Mao Zedong, but we find it really comfortable when it's our own political figures that we put up. And I'm arguing that the sculpturing of important figures and putting them up for honor and veneration constitutes idolatry. And so by the 12th century, we still had the Roman Empire, or the Holy Roman Empire, in control. And most of European nation states as we have them today had not yet developed. And so by the 14th and the 15th centuries, the papacy as a center of authority and political power was declining, partly due to the clerical corruption in the Catholic Church, and also partly due to the rise of nationalism amongst various European nation states. And so by this time, the concept or the idea of identity as a nation began to take hold in the minds of most Europeans. That's about 700 years ago, who had previously just considered themselves as natives of a county or a city. This nationalist sentiment undermined and weakened the papal claims to universal authority. And before this final decline, the papacy was the greatest and strongest seat of political and spiritual power on earth, behind which Satan was exerting his power. By the time of the Reformation, most of the reformers, including Martin Luther, realized that the papacy had become the seat of the Antichrist in the world. And that was a true observation, and it has remained the same up to this day. The nationalism changed the face of Europe and ultimately the rest of the modern world. The nation states that developed in order of power and influence, that is very important and very critical now for you to understand why God will judge Western civilization and particular nation states within Western civilization. So the nation states that developed in order of power and influence, even global influence, were Spain, Portugal, France, the Dutch or Lower Countries, Britain, and later on Germany and Italy. Now these nations and other European nations would begin to aspire and compete to build overseas empires, which is what I call that is Rome going abroad. Now these nation states that I've mentioned here are the 7 strong European nation states that built overseas empires. And remember, we had talked about Nebuchadnezzar's statue that had feet of iron and clay, and we had concluded that this feet constituted the barbarian tribes that overran the Roman Empire, and 7 of these barbarian tribes ended up being Spain, Portugal, Germany, France, Dutch country, and Great Britain. And so these nation states began to aspire and compete for overseas empires, and they're ruthlessly devouring, crushing, and trampling underfoot everything in its path. Now, this is the history or the story of colonialism. And I could say a lot, I could read a lot here, but in summary, you have to understand that European colonialism and imperialism literally put the entire globe under bondage, and most of the people that these nation states put under bondage are still suffering under that bondage today. Beginning from North America, the original inhabitants of this continent are still subjugated people. And not only so, it's the same in South America. And not only so, during this period of the Europeans going abroad was the gruesome practice of the slave trade. And the effects of the slave trade are still prevalent today. And people are still suffering under the effects of that colonial impulse. And each of these nation states had the way by which they practice the slave trade or their colonialism. And lots and lots and lots of natives, Africans, Native Americans lost their lives in the process of European nations settling abroad. This is what is going to bring judgment to Western civilization. You have to understand that. And if this is where you have originated from, there is nothing you can hide behind. You cannot defend such atrocities. The only way of escape is to hide in Jesus. Otherwise, you will have to face God's judgment. Now, you have to understand God is not just judging the world arbitrarily. He's judging the world according to what they have done. We had seen in Exodus 20 that God punishes up to the third and fourth generations. So you cannot dissociate yourself today and say, well, I am just here now. Well, a lot of people still enjoy the benefits of the slave trade today and of the displacement of native people today. So that is in a nutshell what I'm going to cover here. So you can understand why would God judge European nation states and their daughters overseas. Modern European colonialism. The history of mankind is a story of conquest and domination since the time men were scattered at Babel. The history of Western civilization, the Mesopotamians, the Egyptians, Assyrians, Babylonians, the Persians, the Greeks, the Romans, and Europeans is a story of conquest and domination. Even the history of the chosen people to an extent was also a history of conquest and domination of the land of Canaan. So, sacred history revolves. I want you to understand that right from the time of Daniel, God gave this revelation to Nebuchadnezzar and gave it to Daniel. So I say here that sacred history revolves around these great Western civilizations and how they will end. And we're not excluding the rest of the world. The entire world is going to be judged. But first and foremost, this dazzling statue that Nebuchadnezzar saw, these four beasts that Daniel saw, represents Western civilization and how it is going to end. Christ is going to come back. He's going to crush them into ashes. And then the world is going to become the kingdom of God and of his Christ. And only those who are in Jesus are going to survive into this kingdom. So I said, God himself set this clock in motion, and this is why he foretells it before it happens and will bring it to a close as we begin the new age, the kingdom of God on earth. So right here, we are just looking at the modern European colonization and how it developed after the crumbling of the Roman Empire. Of course, we say that the Roman Empire never crumbled at all. It was just sort of taken over by the barbarian tribes that eventually became the nation states that I've already listed here as Portugal, Spain, France, Germany, the Dutch, and Italy, and Great Britain. And so before we go on here, I want us to look at what Acts 17:26-27 says. It basically shows us that before the modern European colonial impulse, every land on earth was occupied by peoples. Sometimes we just tend to call them Aboriginal people because they don't really matter. In most of the cases, most of these people were exterminated or reduced to nothing by European settlers. And God is not asleep. God has promised that He's going to pronounce judgment in favor of the least favored of the earth, and that the strong dominant of the earth are going to be severely judged. Acts 17:26-27 states, "From one man, Adam, God made every nation of men that they should inhabit the whole earth. And He determined the times set for them and the exact places where they should live. God did this so that men would seek Him and perhaps reach out for Him and find Him, though He is not far from any one of us." And so God scattered the peoples out of the whole earth and even determined the exact places where they should live. And so I say here that at the beginning of modern European colonialism, every continent was occupied with indigenous peoples. You had the Aboriginals in Australia, the Chinese in China, the Indians and other Asians in Asia. We had Europeans in Europe. That was their continent given by God. We had Africans in Africa. We had Native Americans or Indians in North and South America. And you can name the rest. And so before the colonial impulse, every continent had people that God had placed in those places. He is the God of the Aboriginal as much as He is the God of the Anglo-Saxon or of the German or of the Spaniard or of the Portuguese. He is not only the God of the Portuguese and not the God of the Amerindian people that the Portuguese hunted and destroyed. We have to understand those things. So therefore, I'm saying that therefore, the displacement of peoples by the colonizing and marauding Europeans, that's the Roman Empire going abroad, is described in sacred history as a devouring, crushing, and trampling underfoot of its victims. And you will see how, and you know how. Don't turn a blind eye to that. So you can understand why God is going to judge the world. So we have seen in the book of Daniel that the Roman Empire is described as having 10 horns. And the book of Revelation gives the same vision with some details, and a stunning linkage is made with Satan directly. Now the European Empire is identified as Satan directly. You have to understand that. In John 10:10, it says that for the devil comes only to kill, to steal, and to destroy. And that those three words describes the modern European colonial practice as it was practiced in North America, in South America, in Africa, and in Asia. Killing, destroying, and stealing. So this is what Revelation 13 verse 3 says. It says, "Then another sign appeared in heaven, an enormous red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 crowns on his head." This is a depiction of Satan, the ancient serpent called the devil, which happens to be identical to the Roman Empire as described in Daniel, except for the addition of 7 heads and 7 crowns. Satan comes down to the shore of the sea, that is the peoples of the earth, Europe then, and a beast or an empire or kingdom is born. You see the linkage here. Who is Satan? The Roman Empire is Satan. He said, and the dragon Satan stood on the shore of the sea, and I saw a beast coming out of the sea. He had 10 horns and 7 heads, with 10 crowns on his horns, and on each head a blasphemous name. So Satan and the beast, which is the Roman Empire or Europe, are united, as Satan gives his power and mandate to the empire, whose identity is Satan's. So it says that the dragon or Satan gave the beast, the Roman Empire, his power and his authority and great authority, or his throne and great authority. So it is unmistakably clear here that Satan's throne is on earth, and he has someone on it, and has been given authority to carry out Satan's plan. For a further understanding of this issue, Jesus gives his servants more clues. It says, then the angel carried me, Revelation 17:3 and 6. Then the angel carried me away in the spirit into a desert. There I saw a woman, which means it's a church, that's the papacy, sitting on a scarlet beast, that is sitting on Europe, that was covered with blasphemous names and had 7 heads and 10 horns. Which, of course, as we have seen, this is identical, the identical wording for Satan's description in Revelation chapter 12, verse 3. This woman was drunk with the blood of the saints, the blood of those who bore the testimony of Jesus. And of course, we know the testimony of Jesus is the spirit of prophecy. So how do we know this woman is a church? We know because the Church of Jesus Christ is also described in the same context as a woman. It says, a great and wondrous sight appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun and with the moon under her feet, and a crown of 12 stars. This depicts the Church of Jesus Christ. And then also there is another woman, which is the Church of Satan, where Satan's throne is. We need to understand that. So of the persecution of Christ's church by the dragon or Satan or the papacy, it is written, when the dragon saw that he had been hurled to the earth, he pursued the woman who gave birth to the male child. The woman was given the 2 wings of a great eagle so that she should fly to a place prepared for her in the desert, where she would be taken care of for a time, times, and half a time out of the serpent's reach. So it's a further identification of the woman drunk with the blood of the saints, and the beast, she writes, is given as follows. This calls for a mind with wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 hills. Rome was built on 7 hills, on which the woman sits. There are also 7 kings. That is the 7 barbarian tribes that survived the papacy and their modern nations or kingdoms, namely Portugal, Spain, the Dutch, France, Italy, Germany, and Britain. 5 have fallen. 1 is, the other has not yet come, but when he comes, he must remain for a little while. The beast who once was, which is Babylon, and is not, is an 8, which is the USA. He belongs to the 7. You have to understand that we have these 7 nations: Portugal, Spain, the Dutch, France, Italy, Germany, and Britain. And out of Britain came an 8 imperial power, which is the USA. So he is an 8, but he is of the 7. So we see only 7 kings here, as we saw earlier, because 7 of the horns out of the 10 had been uprooted by the papacy. So my question is, how have these 7 kingdoms, the ones we have listed, these colonial empires, and the 8 colonial power, all offsprings of Europe or of Rome, how have they influenced and shaped the world today? How have these nations influenced and shaped the world today? Before we examine that question, let us examine the motive of the colonial impulse. Given that Europe is identified with Satan, let us consider the following passage that best describes the European colonial impulse. Jesus said the thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy. We have already mentioned that. These three words perfectly describe the whole colonial enterprise in the modern era: destroying, killing, and stealing. And it was described in Daniel as devouring, crushing, smashing, and breaking to pieces and trampling underfoot. Now, some of the motives for colonialism included the following. Number one, European curiosity in the rest of the world provoked by better navigation and new military capability. Number two, Europeans wanted a new route to tap the riches of the East. And the first in this venture were the Portuguese. Number three, Europeans wanted to capture the gold trade in Western Africa. They developed a lucrative trade in gold, ivory, sugar, and slaves. Number four, greed and profit. Greed and profit. That has become the very definition of capitalism for the past 500 years at the expense of the colonized. At the expense of the colonized. So why would God judge these nation states? You see why this is going to be the case here. So it's reported that when Vasco da Gama returned from India, his return cargo sold for 60 times the cost of his expedition. And this provoked the curiosity of many adventurers who hurried to the East Indies and carved out a large commercial and political empire. The thief comes to kill, steal, and destroy. That is the very definition of the colonial enterprise. And if you have a different argument, I am ready to listen to it. If this was not the practice of Europeans as they settled outside of Europe or as they colonized the entire earth. Number five, as would later be followed by the Spaniards, the English, French, and the Dutch, Europeans went out in search of gold, silver, and precious germ and riches. They were bent on exploitation. If it meant killing and destroying before stealing, they did not hesitate to do so. Bent on building overseas empires and a lucrative trade, some Europeans left their home without any hope of ever returning, and wherever they settled, they mistreated the indigenous people and displaced some permanently. The side effects of this savagery and barbarous behavior is still lingering and affecting many people today. You just need to keep current with indigenous people where Europeans settled, especially in the Americas, and you will know what I'm talking about. God is seeing and has been seeing, and everything is going to come into judgment. No one is going to escape. You cannot treat fellow human beings like that and you stand up in front of God in church and say, God, I praise you. The book of John, 1 John says that if you cannot love men that you see, don't pretend. Don't pretend that you know and love God. You are a liar. You cannot treat indigenous people like that. You cannot treat Africans like that. And you stand in church and claim that you know God. You are a liar. You came to steal, you came to destroy, and you came to kill. And you killed and you destroyed. Let's just look a little bit here on the practice of colonialism. And we're going straight to first the Portuguese. These are just excerpts. Like I've said, go to my website and you read it there. And if you have a water lunch, I'm ready for it. Portugal. The Portuguese were the first by discovering a sea route to the east. In 1510, a Portuguese expedition took over the Arab, Indian, and Malayan trading centers in India. Also, and I quote someone here, Portuguese ships carried slaves and ivory from Africa to India, where they were exchanged for spices, cloth, and glassware. Okay, they were trading in human beings. There is something you have to understand, that in all this, the African has suffered the most in the hands of the Europeans, both in continental Africa and in the New World. You may assume that the God of the African is dead. You are making a mistake, because he is alive and he has been watching, and time is short. On his second voyage in 1502, Vasco da Gama threatened to burn down the town of Kilwa in present-day Tanzania unless the ruling sultan acknowledged the supremacy of the king of Portugal and paid an annual tribute in gold. Lacking the power to resist, the sultan capitulated. Later, when the port of Sofala in Mozambique fell to the Portuguese, Portugal controlled the gold shipped from the interior. Mombasa in present-day Kenya resisted the Portuguese, but the Portuguese, after looting the ancient and wealthy city, burnt it down and sailed away. In summary, by their actions, Europeans destroyed the old systems of Indian Ocean trade, which had brought wealth and cultural enrichment to many parts of Asia and Africa. That is what the Portuguese did: destructive, killing, and stealing. So the Portuguese were disparaged in their racial discrimination, and with the Bantu peoples, their main target of scorn. The Bantu-speaking coastal peoples were regarded by the Portuguese as a lower caste and were relegated to menial jobs. And some of them were captured as slaves, especially those along the coastal areas. The Portuguese saw Angola as a source of slaves, and through the use of force established a Portuguese colony there. They also established another colony in the east coast of Africa in Mozambique. And on the Portuguese overall impact on Africa, an author has concluded that Portugal's influence on Africa was largely negative because her interest was narrowly commercial. Their rule was harsh and did not foster appreciation of European civilization amongst Africans. In the Orient, Portugal saw that she could not conquer the Indians, Chinese, and the Japanese, and thus he settled for a policy of trade. This helped them establish many trading posts. Westward, Portugal had laid claim on Brazil, whose wood served as a source of wealth, and later on sugarcane, the growing and processing of which required cheap labor, resulting in enslaving of Indians. Without sufficient slaves, the Portuguese began importing slaves from Africa. Now, these are people who had the Bible, and other humans became their property, and they used them as they could. And today, the effects of that slave trade and the treatment of those Africans continue to linger. There is a God in heaven who is going to judge. Now you're beginning to understand why God is going to judge the world, particularly the Western world. Spain did the same thing as they settled in Central America, burning and destroying everything in their path. Just turn to the books of history. You will see the story of this colonial empires as it was practiced. The Dutch will do the same in South Africa. We know the story of apartheid in South Africa. And it may look like it's over, but you just have to understand that God is going to judge the strong of this earth, who have become strong, riding on the backs of others, turning others to the beast of burden. Don't suppose that you're going to stand before God and say, God, take me into your kingdom, when you have mutilated, destroyed people who were made in the image of God. You cannot survive with that. And worse still, we understand that even the African continent today, even though we think that it's independent, are still suffering under the hands of the Europeans, particularly France. A parasite that really does not care whether the host plant survives or not. It was not only the colonial impulse or the colonial practice that destroyed and dehumanized the peoples of the earth, particularly the African. It was not only that. In fact, it's reported that about 50 Africans were displaced during the 3 centuries of the slave trade. 50 million. Africa was deprived of its prime individuals at the time that Europe was building her civilization. And of those 50 people, about 35 million of them lost their lives. We can make a lot of noise about how many people lost their lives in World War II and World War I. But 35 million Africans lost their lives in the hands of Europeans. That is the first world war that is unspoken of. But God is taking account. God is taking account. France. I have a particular anger against France because France's policy in Africa is so destructive and brings a lot of carnage even to this moment. France is a leech on Africa, and Africans are dying every day, even where I'm from, because of the French leadership. And you cannot escape God's judgment. You just have to understand that. It's a matter of time. You cannot escape God's judgment. You cannot continue to be stealing from African nations to build your economy. You watch out. So the French, like the British, came into the discovery venture later than the Portuguese and the Spaniards, and nevertheless they did not continue to do they did continue to do their own exploits. And France has always been a rival of France of England, and I'm kind of choking up talking about France because even at this moment that we're speaking, French Africa is still sweating under the hands of the thieves called the French. Yes, you are thieves. If you're not thieves, prove it to me. Otherwise, prove it to me otherwise that you are not thieves. You are killers, you are destroyers. And you will face God's judgment for that. You also realize that the African was made in the image of God. And you cannot treat him like that. Okay. Let's see where we're going here. Yeah, and rounding it up here, like I said, I want you to go there to my website and you can read this. It's well constructed there, well written out, so you can know. So the question, as I'm just running it up here, I'll leave it at that, is, so why would God judge Western civilization? Because in his practices, in his roadway to developing the global capitalism, they went out, they destroyed, they killed, and stole everything in their path, dehumanized entire groups of human beings made in the image of God. And yet, they had the Bible for a long time. You will not go free. You cannot go free. The only option is, as I've said, anyone who hides under Jesus will avert God's judgment, but you're too proud to do that. And so you will face God's judgment. The indigenous peoples of Australia, of Papua New Guinea, the natives of North America, the Africans, are humans made in the image of God. They are not the property of Europeans to treat and to use the way you have used them. And I just want to remind you that God is not dead. God is not dead. These people were made in His image. And He's going to stand up for them. He's going to pronounce judgment on their behalf. You cannot treat other human beings like that.